Good morning, all, and today's video is on my autism traits number 3 and 4. These are physical traits of autism spectrum disorder, of being autistic, and these traits are early brain overgrowth, causing a large size head in the relevant range of between about the ages of 2 and 4, as well as wide set eyes. Okay, so when we're talking about my childhood autistic trait, we first have to know that there may be a difference between how the majority of neurotypicals on the outside looking in have defined what it means to be autistic. Because what we have to know is those people are not actually autistic. So those people have no way to know what the internal being autistic feels like and how it is experienced. And so the place that we have to start, and I'll refer to this video here by Autistic AF, Mike, Think You're Autistic, my DSM-V-TR guide for 2025. He goes through the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, text revised, what you need to know, with numerous comments, since he is autistic, about his autistic experience in the face of what the outsiders looking in who wrote the DSM-V-TR had to say about autism. Autism is also diagnosed mostly outside the United States under the ICD-11, which is a little bit different, but this video here, right here, kind of gives you an overview of the Autism Spectrum Disorder diagnostic criteria under the ICD-11. And in the United States, we have one of the most frequented federal with state component agencies that parents of autistic children and autistic adults have to deal with to obtain the autism supports and services we should be getting is the Social Security Administration. The Social Security Administration has this oddity and weirdness going on with how it assesses individuals who are autistic. So, first of all, I asked ChatGPT who wrote the Social Security Administration's 2 listings of impairments for autism spectrum disorder and when. Because Social Security Administration divides children with autism, listing of impairments, from adults with autism spectrum disorders. And what this does is it makes, for adults who are autistic, it makes the Social Security Administration and their ALJs, administrative law judges, go astray in the way they use a DSM-4, 5, or DSM-V-TR diagnosis of autism. In other words, because they have 2 listings of impairments, when it comes to adults who are making a claim of being disabled based on autism spectrum disorder, well, the Social Security ALJs don't track the diagnostic criteria in the DSM-4, 5, or DSM-V-TR for autism spectrum disorder. There's a mismatch. In other words, you can be diagnosed as being autistic with autism and autism spectrum disorder, and Social Security's ALJs will basically F it up. They will not match their listing of impairments or their assessment in the claims process to the diagnosis the autistic person obtained under the DSM-4, 5, or 5-TR. So, I asked ChatGPT, who wrote the Social Security Administration's 2 listings of impairments for autism spectrum disorder and when? And here's what ChatGPT told me. And in the United States, we have one of the most frequented federal with state component agencies that parents of autistic children and autistic adults have to deal with to obtain the autism supports and services we should be getting is the Social Security Administration. The Social Security Administration has this oddity and weirdness going on with how it assesses individuals who are autistic. So, first of all, I asked ChatGPT who wrote the Social Security Administration's 2 listings of impairments for autism spectrum disorder and when. Because Social Security Administration divides children with autism, listing of impairments, from adults with autism spectrum disorders. And what this does is it makes, for adults who are autistic, it makes the Social Security Administration and their ALJs, administrative law judges, go astray in the way they use a DSM-4, 5, or DSM-V-TR diagnosis of autism. In other words, because they have 2 listings of impairments, when it comes to adults who are making a claim of being disabled based on autism spectrum disorder, well, the Social Security ALJs don't track the diagnostic criteria in the DSM-4, 5, or DSM-V-TR for autism spectrum disorder. There's a mismatch. In other words, you can be diagnosed as being autistic with autism and autism spectrum disorder, and Social Security's ALJs will basically F it up. They will not match their listing of impairments or their assessment in the claims process to the diagnosis the autistic person obtained under the DSM-4, 5, or 5-TR. So, I asked ChatGPT who wrote the Social Security Administration's 2 listings of impairments for autism spectrum disorder and when. And here's what ChatGPT told me. Social Security Administration's listings of impairments for autism spectrum disorder are developed and maintained by SSA's Office of Disability Policy, ODP. These listings are part of the Blue Book, which provides medical criteria for determining disability under the SSA programs. The listings for autism spectrum disorder. 1. Children's listing 112.10. Designed for individuals under the age of 18. reflects developmental and functional impairments associated with ASD. Adult listing 12.10 applies to individuals aged 18 and over, focuses on functional impairments and how autism impacts activities of daily living, social functioning, and the ability to sustain work. And of course, notice here that in the adult listings, there's no mandatory rule at the Social Security Administration that pertains to the onset of disability that requires SSA to make the determination that is defined by the autism diagnosis under the DSM-IV, 5, and 5-TR, that autism begins on or before the age of 3. So the onset of the autistic disability is on or before the age of 3. So you get Social Security ALJs thinking that it's acquired, that you catch it, that you develop it as an age-related decline, and they arbitrarily and capriciously pronounce that your autism began on or before the age of, for example, 59. A physical impossibility and a total absurdity. So let's continue. We're talking about when the Social Security Administration autism spectrum listings of impairments, one for children and one for adults, were written. The timeline, according to ChatGPT, 1, initial development. The listings for autism were originally introduced in the 1990s under the broader category of pervasive developmental disorders, reflecting the diagnostic framework at that time, DSM-IV and earlier. Now, I'm just going to interject a note here that we know now by scientific studies that 80% of females who are autistic are being late diagnosed after the age of 18. We know that the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorders, was normed on cis white little boys. And so they contain within them gender bias, gender discrimination that is actionable under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as amended. So right here, ChatGPT is telling us that the initial development included the use of male gender bias, a listing of impairments for autism that were based on the male bias diagnostic criteria. 2, 2017 revisions. Both the children's and adult listings were significantly revised effective January 17th, 2017. These revisions were made to align the criteria with modern diagnostic standards, including updates from the DSM-V, which replaced pervasive developmental disorder with autism spectrum disorder. Key contributors. The listings are drafted by a team of medical consultants, psychologists, and legal professionals within the SSA, with inputs from experts in disability law and medicine. Notice, they don't say they're autism experts, specialists in autism spectrum disorders, particularly the female phenotype. And it's been my experience, lifelong experience, dealing with Social Security Administration, that, in my opinion, they don't have any doctor on board whatsoever, not an examining doctor, not a medical consultant, no one that has an autism Autism Spectrum Disorder specialization, who are experts in autism spectrum disorders, and especially the female phenotype. Every time they try to send you to an examination, it's a mental retardation expert or a different type of mental illness expert with no autism expertise whatsoever in their curriculum vitas. This is the pattern and practice that, based on my first-hand personal experience, I have observed. Public comments are often solicited during the rulemaking process, as was the case with the 2017 revisions. Final approval. The criteria are subject to review and approval by higher administrative levels within SSA and are published in the Federal Register as a part of formal rulemaking. In the United States, the Federal Register and the formal rulemaking process for federal agencies, and as well as the rulemaking process for all federal courts. They have this neurotypicalized rulemaking process where they use black and white small print, and they don't send it to affected people. They expect the affected people to just somehow know their rulemaking without being alerted, and somehow know where to go to comment on their rulemaking. Well, autistic people can't do that, most of us. First of all, it's very well known, and you queried it on Google, that due to the sensory overstimulation in autistic people, especially to bright lights and high contrast, a number of us cannot see to read black and white print without going into an instant autistic meltdown. And that harms us. So using black and white print in small print to give notice of formal rulemaking, federal rulemaking of these agencies published in the Federal Register, it is not meaningfully calculated to give notice to autistic people on the autism spectrum. Any fly-by-night website by any type of scammer can give you print in any color on the color wheel, not just forcibly neurotypical mask an autistic person to have to subject themselves to bright lights and black and white stark contrasts that cause autism meltdowns. Oh no, not the feds, not the Federal Register, and not the formal rulemaking process. So when Social Security tries to peddle the false advertisement narrative that the criteria were subject to formal rulemaking and notice to an affected population of autistic people just because they went through the Federal Register formal rulemaking process, well, no, it's not, and it doesn't meet basic due process to give notice at a meaningful time and in a meaningful manner to autistic people, at least many autistic people like me. So that digression had to be said. So when Social Security is standing behind the shield of, we did federal rulemaking, so our rules are valid, and they can't be male biased discriminatory, no such thing. That's a lie, and it's anything but. And in a few minutes, I'll say why that is. Key considerations. Well, the SSA's ASD listings aim to reflect functional impairments. They have been criticized for being too narrowly focused on traditional male presentations of autism and insufficiently updated to incorporate new research or gender differences such as the female phenotype. Advocacy and litigation have pushed the SSA to better address how ASD affects individuals differently based on age, gender, and functional variation. For further details on this, ChatGPT says, make a Freedom of Information request, FOIA request, on the Social Security Administration. So, this has been my personal experience with Social Security Administration, my lifelong experience. But when an autistic person or their family members are interacting with Social Security's administrative law judges, and those administrative law judges start experiencing and interacting with the autistic person, in almost every single circumstance, you get a hostile Social Security administrative law judge. It just seems to be a pattern and a practice at Social Security Administration. So, I saw a video on YouTube from an Orlando Social Security attorney that was entitled something like Hostile Social Security ALJs. And I watched it about what can you do when the Social Security's ALJ turns hostile and turns the Social Security autism disability claim process adversarial. So I commented on it because it's been my experience over hundreds of lawyers and judges and ALJs in my lifetime. I went to law school. It's been my experience that without exception, virtually 100% of them, the moment that they experience and interact with an autistic person, they turn hostile immediately. So it all seems to depend on whether or not they've had any autism educational training, so that they understand what it means to be autistic. If they don't have this training, that fact alone causes bias and prejudice against the autistic person. So I commented on this video and said, how do I find out what kind of autism educational training ALJ has had? Thank you. So Seahorse 251 responded. DDS adjudicators, those are the Social Security ALJs, don't have education on autism. So don't expect the ALJ to have education. And there you have it. You have these Social Security administrative law judges deciding whether an autistic adult is going to get the supports and services they need. And these ALJs have zero autism education. They don't know what the heck they're doing. They don't know what kind of red flags to look for. They don't know how to spot autism. They don't know what the traits and characteristics of being autistic are. Okay, and so now this gets us back to my physical autism traits, my childhood autism traits, number 3 and 4. This is a genuine and authentic picture of me at between the ages of 3 and 4. And in this picture, you can see the widespread eyes and the brain overgrowth, large head, larger than a neurotypical child's. This is a physical trait of autism. This is a physical trait that would tell anyone who had any type of state-of-the-art autism educational training that I'm autistic. Autistic people hear this a lot. There's YouTube videos about this. Lots of autistic adults encounter neurotypical people who say, you don't look autistic. And you hear that from multiple judges and lawyers in Florida. I heard it from a Alachua County Sheriff deputy who accompanied my neighbor to cut through my locks and my no trespass sign, break into my horse farm, and steal a third of my land that I had been in possession of a long time. And here's the response to that. You can identify some physical traits of autism in some autistic people. Why can't you spot the physical traits of autism or the other diagnostic traits of autism in an autistic person? It's because you don't have an autism education, so you can't spot it. And so, an autism education is vital. And yes, there are more and more physical traits of autism, biological traits that are being documented in research studies that are identifiable. So, let's talk about the autistic child who between the ages of 2 and 5 has a much larger head than her neurotypical peers that is showing physical trait of brain overgrowth. Well, does the DSM-5 and 5-TR or even the ICD-11 include these physical traits or even talk about them? No. Well, when was the DSM-5 released? 2013. When was the DSM-5-TR released? 2022. Oh, well, what happens when there's more recent studies than that on autism that are finding physical traits? These are physical traits that are correlated to the severity of social and language and sensory behaviors in autism, in autistic individuals, such that they could serve at least as the kind of physical trait biomarker that would make a DSM-5 or 5-TR autism spectrum diagnosis more accurate. Let's turn to the latest study on brain overgrowth in autistic toddlers. On May 25th, 2024, and you can find it here online, Molecular Autism published an open access article by Eric, and I'm autistic. I've always had some of my 2-year-old pronunciation problems in language. Eric Korkisny et al. Embryonic origin of 2 ASD subtypes of social symptom severity. The larger the brain cortical organoid size, the more severe the social symptoms. Open access. And that's the article here. This research suggests, and this is the University of California, San Diego.edu release about that study. An unusually large brain may be the first sign of autism and visible as early as the first trimester as a fetus. Press release of June 17, 2024 states, some children with profound autism experience lifelong difficulties with social language and cognitive skills and even lack the ability to speak. Others experience more mild symptoms that improve with time. The new study found that the biological basis for these 2 subtypes of autism spectrum disorder develops in the first weeks and months of embryonic development. Well, how did they determine that? Well, the researchers used inducible pluripotent stem cells, iPSCs, derived from blood samples of 10 toddlers with autism and 6 neurotypical controls of the same age. And these kind of stem cells are able to be reprogrammed into any kind of human cell. So they used them to create brain cortical organoids, models of the brain's cortex during the first weeks of embryonic development. And so basically what these are, what they grow into, what a brain cortical organoid is a little growing mini brain that grows out of these pluripotent stem cells that the researchers are cultivating and collecting from the blood of autistic toddlers and neurotypical toddlers. So let's just remember that when we listen to Orion, that autistic guy, there's one thing Orion keeps driving home, and that is autistic people have a different brain. Autistic people have a different brain. Well, these brain cortical organoids that were cultured from the toddlers with autism grew far larger, around 40% larger than those of the neurotypical controls, demonstrating the growth that occurred during the child's embryonic development. So, Dr. Korkizny found the larger the embryonic brain cortical organoid size, the more severe the child's later autism social symptoms. Dr. Korkizny is not only this study's lead researcher, but co-director of the Autism Center of Excellence in the Neuroscience Department at UC San Diego. And so toddlers who had profound autism, which is the most severe type of autism, that would be level 3, had the largest brain cortical organoid overgrowth during embryonic development. And those with mild autism social symptoms only had mild overgrowth. This here depicts the difference on the left between a neurotypical brain cortical organoid and the overgrowth causing the large head in an autistic person in the autistic toddler's brain cortical organoids that demonstrate autism social severity, the early brain overgrowth in autistic individuals. This comes from the actual study. Social, affective, and communication symptoms are central to autism spectrum disorder, yet their severity differs across toddlers with the disorder. Some ASD toddlers display improving abilities across early ages and develop good language skills and social relationships, while others with profound autism have persistently low social cognition skills, may be nonverbal, have few if any friends, and require lifelong care. And before this study, the biological origins of this remained unknown. Until the study states possible prenatal development origins of core social variation in autism were largely unstudied. In the discussion part of this study, the study states indirect evidence raises the hypothesis that the biological origin for social symptom severity in autism spectrum disorder is early embryogenesis. Greater social symptom severity in ASD toddlers is correlated with greater overactivity of 3 neurodevelopmental pathways, P13K or PI3K-AKT, RAS-ERK, and WNT-B-catenin. And this overactivity compared with neurotypical toddlers occurs in 2D models of embryonic stage ASD progenitors and neurons derived from ASD toddlers with enlarged brains. Since these pathways are major regulators of cell cycle proliferation and maturation, their embryonic overactivity in ASD progenitors and neurons would be expected to increase proliferation and alter neuronal maturation. And in fact, that's what these indirect studies found in the ASD toddler-derived cell models. Before this study, No autism spectrum disorder patient-derived iPSC study to date has examined whether variation in patient-derived embryonic brain cortical organoid enlargement is correlated with the variation in autism spectrum disorder social severity and autism spectrum disorder social subtypes at early ages. The question has high importance because if embryonic pathological cortical growth is correlated with later postnatal social severity and subtypes, then it means causal mechanisms driving to social severity and subtypes are already present before other speculated environmental and genetic factors associated with later phases of prenatal development. And like Autistic AF, I'm not a fan of the pathologizing and deficit-based language, but I'm just reporting here on what this study says and what it found. This study's choice of iPSC model and measurement was because early brain overgrowth ascribed to excess excitatory neurons and first described 2 decades ago is a characteristic found in many children with autism spectrum disorder. The most pronounced brain and head size increases occur at early ages in autism spectrum disorder, suggesting a prenatal origin. The first direct evidence of unusual prenatal brain development in ASD comes from ultrasound measures showing second trimester fetal head enlargement in individuals later confirmed to have autism spectrum disorder. This 2000 open access autism research paper by Dr. Korkisny et al. Is extremely important because it demonstrated that the larger the autism spectrum disorder brain cortical organoid, the more severe the autism spectrum disorder social symptoms. Larger ASD brain cortical organoid sizes were positively correlated with greater autism spectrum disorder social symptom severity in both the 2021 and 2022 batches. This correlation was significant at 1 month and at 2 months in the 2021 batch. Those ASD toddlers with larger brain cortical organoid sizes had significantly more severe symptom scores. In the 2022 replication batch, brain cortical organoid size was again significantly correlated with ADOS social severity score. The 2021 batch, toddlers with enlarged brain cortical organoids had the most severe social symptoms, lowest IQ, least social eye tracking attention, and most extreme cortical volumes in social language, face, and sensory regions. The brain cortical organoids in severe autism spectrum disorder were larger than the brain cortical organoids in mild autism spectrum disorder. At both brain cortical organoid time points of postnatal 1 month and 2 months of age, the severe ASD subtype had the largest brain cortical organoid, followed by the mild ASD subtype. Controls, the neurotypical children, had the smallest brain cortical organoids. Moreover, across time points, the severe ASD subtype brain cortical organoids, i.e. profound ASD, or would be level 3 ASD, increased, but the mild ASD subtype brain cortical organoids did not change significantly from the first to the second month. The severe ASD subtype with enlarged brain cortical organoids had severe social symptoms and very low social attention, low global IQ, and low receptive and expressive language. The study found that by embryogenesis, the biological bases of the two contrasting subtypes of autism spectrum disorder, social and brain development, profound severe autism and mild autism, are already distinguishable and measurable and involve dysregulated proliferation and accelerated neurogenesis and growth. The larger the embryonic brain cortical organoid size, the more severe the ASD toddler's social symptoms, the more reduced the IQ, social attention, and language ability, and the more atypical the social, language, and sensory brain growth. In addition, research led by Mark Shen, PhD, Heather Hazlitt, PhD, and Joseph Piven, MD, from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, demonstrated overgrowth of the amygdala in the first year of life in individuals who are later identified as being autistic. And that is in this study here. This is a press release of the study. Researchers have long known that the amygdala is abnormally large in school-age children with autism. For the first time, researchers from the Infant Brain Imaging Study Network demonstrated that the amygdala grows too rapidly in infancy. This UNC study, Chapel Hill, also found that the rate of the amygdala overgrowth in the first year is linked to the child's social deficits at age 2. The faster the amygdala grew in infancy, the more social difficulties the child showed when diagnosed with autism a year later. Does the amygdala begin to form? This is an AI overview on Google. The amygdala in a fetus begins to form during the 5th week of post-conceptional development, which is considered the early embryonic stage, meaning the major structures of the amygdala can be identified by the end of the first month of pregnancy. This is the first trimester. What does my physical childhood autistic trait number 4, wide set eyes, mean? Well, wide set eyes also is known as orbital hypertelorism, typically occurs during the early stages of fetal development between the 4th and 8 weeks of pregnancy, when the eye sockets are forming and positioning themselves on the face. If something disrupts this normal movement, the eyes can remain too far apart. Well, what can disrupt the normal development of the places of the eye sockets that are forming between the 4th and 8th weeks of pregnancy? Well, overgrowth in the amygdala that's forming in the fetus that begins to form during the 5th week as a fetus can disrupt the normal movement of the eye sockets. Hence, when the fetus has brain overgrowth in the amygdala as it's forming in the 5th week as a fetus in the first trimester, it could disrupt the normal movement of the eye sockets, which are developing between the 4th and 8th weeks as a fetus during pregnancy. So, hence, the large head, brain overgrowth, my childhood autistic physical trait number 3, is related to my physical childhood autistic trait number 4. My wide set eyes. But these two physical traits of my childhood autistic traits tell us is that I had significant brain overgrowth. In other words, that if a brain cortical organoid were taken from my pluripotent stem cells, it would most likely show the type of brain cortical organoid overgrowth that would fall in the one on the right of the most severe autism, social and language severity. So I had 2 childhood physical traits of being autistic. And the brain enlargement observed in autistic individuals at 2 years of age continues to be present to the same degree at ages 4 to 5 years. And here I am at between ages 3 and 4 years old with the telltale sign of the enlarged head caused by the brain overgrowth of an autism spectrum disorder. And my head was much larger than my neurotypical peers. And my eyes are wide set. So this picture demonstrates that my autism began likely during the first trimester as a fetus, that it is more probable than not, and that this is documented by the scientific studies of what is known in the state of the art about autism in 2024 today. I asked ChatGPT, what about this situation where the Social Security's listing of impairments and let's break it down into 2 separate questions. The first question I asked ChatGPT is, a very recent brain organoid study demonstrated that autistic children have a physical trait of early brain overgrowth. A 2024 study demonstrated that autistic children have delayed eruption of teeth in the developmental trajectory, and that will be a future video. Explain how the DSM-V-TR takes these physical autism traits into consideration in the diagnostic process, and if it does not do so, explain why this is wrong and needs to be fixed to ensure no actually autistic person will be denied an autism diagnosis, especially females. And here's what ChatGPT 4.0 had to say. The DSM-V-TR, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders Text Revision, does not currently include physical traits like early brain overgrowth or delayed tooth eruption in the diagnostic criteria for Autism Spectrum Disorder, ASD. Its diagnostic framework focuses on behavioral and developmental characteristics such as social communication deficits and restricted repetitive patterns of behavior. The reliance on behavioral criteria means physical or biological markers of autism, such as those identified in recent studies, are not a part of the formal diagnostic process. Current limitations of the DSM-V-TR. 1. Exclusion of biological and physical traits. The DSM-V-TR centered on observable behaviors and developmental history rather than incorporating biological markers of physical characteristics like those suggested by studies on brain growth or dental development. As a result, these scientifically validated physical traits are not used to support or refine diagnoses, even though they could be significant in identifying individuals with autism, especially in cases with subtler behavioral presentation. Challenges for females with autism. The diagnostic framework often reflects a male-centric model of autism with behavioral traits that are more commonly observed in boys, such as overt repetitive behaviors or pronounced social deficits. Females who may mask their symptoms or present differently are more likely to be overlooked under this system, as their behavioral differences might not meet the threshold for a diagnosis despite underlying neurodevelopmental differences. Adding physical traits like delayed tooth eruption and early brain overgrowth could help identify females who might otherwise fall through the cracks. Okay, so basically what ChatGPT is saying here is that there is a gender bias in the fact that today, December 5th, 2024, the DSM-V-TR has not updated itself to include these physical traits. So by not including them, they're engaging in gender discrimination if an autistic female like me was missed in an autism diagnosis, which I was for many years until 2009. Well, my parents had one, but basically they didn't tell me. So then as an adult, I didn't know. I went to doctors and they all misdiagnosed me. And in 2009, I got a second late autism diagnosis. So basically, I could have sued the writers and the publishers of the DSM-V and V-TR for gender discrimination under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 for my missed autism diagnosis and could have asked for damages. I mean, that's how bad this is. ChatGPT 4.0 says, why the exclusion of physical traits is a problem. Missed diagnoses. One, misdiagnoses. Focusing solely on behaviors ignores biological markers that may indicate autism, leading to misdiagnoses for individuals with atypical presentations. Behavioral symptoms can vary widely between individuals, but physical traits like brain overgrowth might serve as consistent markers that enhance diagnostic precision. 2. Over-reliance on subjective assessment. Behavioral diagnostics are inherently subjective depending on observation and interpretation by clinicians who may have biases or lack familiarity with diverse presentations of autism, e.g. female phenotype, cultural differences. And here I would also add ageism of all the 9 out of 10 autistic individuals who remain diagnosed in autistic individuals over the age of 50. And this is a big problem with Social Security's examiners and medical consultants and their ALJs is they're using these male bias subjective assessments. And if these physical traits could make more precision, then I know as to myself that this becomes a denial of due process issue in pursuing a Social Security claim, as well as a charge of illegal gender-based discrimination because I'm a female. Number 3, lagging behind scientific advances. The DSM framework has not yet integrated findings from neurobiology, genetics, and physical development studies. This disconnect between clinical practice and scientific research delays improvements in autism diagnostics. The need for change in the DSM-V-TR. 1. Inclusion of biological and physical markers. Incorporating findings like early brain growth and delayed tooth eruption could create a hybrid diagnostic model, combining behavioral observations with physical and biological indicators. This would ensure more comprehensive and precise diagnoses, particularly for populations historically underdiagnosed, such as females and marginalized groups. Gender-specific diagnostic considerations. Female-specific research into autism traits, including biological markers, should inform updates to the DSM to avoid perpetuating the male bias in diagnostics. And I would add Social Security listing of impairments for Autism Spectrum Disorder. 3. Holistic approach to diagnosis. The diagnostic process should involve a multidisciplinary approach incorporating input from developmental pediatricians, neurologists, and geneticists alongside psychologists and psychiatrists. Steps toward reform. 1. Advocacy for research-based updates. Encourage organizations like the American Psychiatric Association, APA, to integrate recent research findings into the DSM framework, starting with the recognition of established physical traits as supportive diagnostic criteria. 2. Development of objective diagnostic tools. Promote the creation and use of tools that measure physical and biological markers of autism alongside behavioral assessments to reduce diagnostic subjectivity. 3. Training for clinicians. Ensure clinicians are trained to recognize both the behavioral and biological aspect of autism, particularly in population, including females. Conclusion. The DSM-V-TR exclusion of physical traits like early brain overgrowth and delayed tooth eruption represents a significant gap in autism diagnostics. In integrating these physical markers would provide an objective, scientifically grounded complement to behavioral criteria, ensuring that no actually autistic individual, especially females, is denied a diagnosis or the support they need. Addressing this flaw is essential for creating a more inclusive and accurate diagnostic process that reflects the full spectrum of autism. So I asked one more question of ChatGPT, and this is my last question for the purposes of this video. And that is because, as I already discussed, Social Security Administration has 2 different listings of impairments for autism spectrum disorder, one for children and one for adults. And so what's happening in my experience, and as to me, but I believe that this is agency-wide within Social Security Administration because of the pompous and brazen nature in which the ALJs do this, that they are using the Adult Autism Spectrum Disorder listing of impairments to substitute it for the DSM-V, DSM-V-TR diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder. And the evidence that they're doing so is that they are, as mentioned, coming up with the arbitrary and physically impossible conclusion. They write into their decisions that the date of the onset of autism is at any arbitrary adult age. At age 59, at age 48, at age 100, at age whenever. And they are not writing as the diagnostic criteria in the DSM requires that autism begins on or before the age of 3. Under the childhood listing, Social Security is required to recognize when onset of autism is. Now, I've gone through this whole video. It's become real clear from the scientific state-of-the-art studies in 2024 that the onset of autism is at least in the first trimester of pregnancy, in the first trimester of the autistic person as a fetus, in fetal life. So it's definitely on or before the age of 3. This can't be ignored under the Adult Autism Spectrum Disorder listing of impairments of the Social Security Administration. So I asked ChatGPT 4.0 this question. As I understand it, SSA's ALJs have been substituting SSA's Adult Autism listing of impairments for the DSM-V diagnostic, that would be the DSM-V-TR also, diagnostic criteria for ASD to reach the conclusion the autism disability does not arise on or before the age of 3. How does this deny a level 3 autistic person a fair hearing? And here's what ChatGPT 4.0 had to say. If the Social Security Administration's administrative law judges, ALJs, are substituting SSA's Adult Autism listing of impairments for the DSM-V or 5-TR diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder to conclude that the autism disability does not arise on or before the age of 3, this approach can deny the level 3 autistic person a fair hearing in several significant ways. Misapplication of diagnostic standards. Diagnostic misalignment. The DSM-V, the gold standard for everywhere I refer to DSM-V, it refers to DSM-V-TR because I asked this question before I actually turned to the DSM-V-TR. But let's continue. The DSM-V, the gold standard for diagnosing ASD, explicitly states that the condition arises during the early developmental period, typically before the age of 3. Using the SSA's adult autism listing to challenge this foundational diagnostic criterion directly contradicts established medical and psychological science. This substitution ignores the fact that autism, by definition, originates in early childhood, and therefore the onset date should never be in question for individuals with a valid ASD diagnosis. In other words, SSA just can't simply take the date you filed the claim if you have an autism diagnosis. Rejection of standardized diagnostic frameworks. By ignoring DSM-V criteria, the ALJ disregards the standardized and universally accepted diagnostic guidelines used by qualified medical professionals, undermining the reliability of the claimant's diagnosis. Gender and phenotype bias in the SSA listing. Male-normed bias. SSA's adult autism listing is known to reflect outdated male bias presentations of autism. These criteria often fail to account for the female autism phenotype, which includes subtle or internalized symptoms and behaviors leading to underrecognition and misinterpretation of autism in women. Disregard for diagnostic realities in females. Females with autism, particularly those who mask their symptoms, may receive a formal diagnosis later in life, even though their disability clearly originated during childhood. The ALJ's reliance on adult-focused criteria overlooks these realities, unfairly penalizing female claimants. 3. I asked this about myself, so I'm reporting what ChatGPT 4.0 told me. 3. Legal and procedural errors. Failure to adhere to statutory and regulatory standards. The Social Security Act requires a determination of disability based on medical evidence and diagnostic criteria established by qualified professionals, not the SSA's own internally developed listing. By prioritizing the SSA's listing over DSM-V criteria, the ALJ may be acting outside their legal authority. Violation of SSA's procedural obligations. SSA must evaluate claims using all the relevant evidence, including diagnostic criteria and medical opinions from treating professionals. Substituting SSA's listing for DSM-V standards undermines this process, leading to arbitrary and capricious decision-making. 4. Denial of evidence-based decision-making. Disregard for medical expertise. The ALJ's substitution of criteria discounts the opinions of medical professionals who diagnose and treat autism. This deprives the claimant of a fair and accurate evaluation based on the best available evidence. For individuals with level 3 autism, whose symptoms often include significant communication and functional impairments, reliance on inaccurate or misaligned criteria disproportionately harms their ability to prove disability. 5. Undermining retroactive diagnosis. Many adults with autism, particularly women, receive a formal diagnosis later in life due to historical biases and lack of understanding about ASD. Using SSA's adult listing to imply that a diagnosis made in adulthood means the condition did not exist before age 3 ignores the retrospective nature of autism diagnoses. Denial of reasonable inferences from evidence. Medical professionals often base an autism diagnosis on evidence from childhood behaviors and developmental history, even if these were not formally recognized at the time. The ALJ's approach disregards this prospective diagnostic process. Exclusion of critical evidence. Improper narrowing of evaluative scope. By focusing solely on the adult listing, the ALJ may exclude or ignore critical evidence demonstrating the onset of autism symptoms before age 3, such as developmental delays or atypical behaviors documented in early medical or educational records, parental or caregiving reports about early childhood behavior consistent with ASD, retrospective clinical evaluations confirming childhood onset, violation of the duty to develop the record. The ALJ has an obligation to fully and fairly develop the record, including gathering evidence that supports early onset of autism. Failing to do so denies the claimant a fair hearing. 7. Lack of accommodations for communication limitations. Compounding disadvantage due to linguistic limitations. The level 3 autistic person may face challenges in clearly articulating how their symptoms align with the DSM-V criteria. Without accommodations like an autism-informed interpreter or representative, they may be unable to effectively counter the ALJ's reliance on SSA's listing. 8. Potential remedies and advocacy. To address these issues, the level 3 autistic person can submit expert evidence, provide written statements or testimony from autism specialists affirming that the disability originated before age 3 and that the diagnosis adheres to DSM-V standards. Challenge the ALJ's approach. Argue that substituting SSA's adult autism listing for DSM-V criteria is a procedural error that violates the duty to base disability determinations on comprehensive evidence-based medical records. Demand procedural accommodations. Request that the ALJ consider additional evidence, provide autism-informed accommodations, and avoid reliance on outdated or biased criteria. Conclusion. The ALJ's substitution of SSA's adult autism listing for DSM-V criteria unfairly denies the level 3 autistic person a hearing based on accurate science-based evidence of her disability by undermining established diagnostic standards, disregarding gender biases in autism presentation, and failing to consider retrospective evidence. The ALJ compromises the fairness and integrity of the hearing process. Addressing these issues through procedural objections, expert testimony, and appeals can help ensure that the claimant receives a fair and lawful evaluation. And so that's my video for today on my childhood autism traits, which are physical traits, number 3 and number 4, my brain overgrowth and large head, that was evident when I was between age 3 to 4, and my wide set eyes that has been documented by Tampa area neurologist Robert Volbrocht, MD. So it's pretty irrefutable that these are autistic physical traits. According to the Korkisny et al. 2024 study, they are correlated with the severity of social functioning that is one of the characteristics that's in the DSM-4, 5, and 5-TR autism diagnostic criteria under Criterion A. So, if you like my videos, please hit the subscribe button and you'll be notified when I post future videos. Ring the notification bell, and thank you for watching.